Did Jesus come so we can just go to heaven? Or is there maybe more to the story of the gospel? Join me as we discover the full picture. So many people always believe this picture of the gospel is basically that we have sinned, Jesus came, died for our sin, so that we can all one day go to heaven. And you'll have to just make sure that you give your life to Jesus in order for you and me to go to heaven. Now, even though that is not untrue, it's not the full picture. It's almost as if the gospel story just has these two chapters. The one chapter that we read about is the fact that humanity has sinned and we've fallen. And then the second chapter is how Jesus needed to come and save us. So it's almost like sin and salvation. However, there are two chapters that's left out of this story. And today, I'd like to take you on a journey where you can discover the full picture. So, this story is not a once upon a time story. It actually starts at the beginning of time, and that is chapter 1. Chapter 1 starts with this beautiful story about a being who decided to create a whole universe, the whole world, everything inside of it. And every single time God creates in Genesis, we see the story taken and unfolding for us in Genesis chapter 1. Every time He creates, He says it is good. There's actually this beautiful symmetry in this story. God creates by bringing order where there's chaos, and then filling that spaces of order with life. And that's a beautiful symmetry. In day 1, He separates darkness and light. In day 2, He separates the waters above from the waters below. In day 3, He separates the earth from the water. And He does a little bonus creation act by putting up trees on this earth. And then we see the symmetry from day 1 to day 4. Day 1, separating darkness and light. And in day 4, He fills that with the sun, moon, and stars. And then in day 2, He separates the waters above from the waters below. So we have the air available and the fish in the sea on day 5. And then in day 6, He fills the land with all kinds of four-legged creatures that creeps on the earth, as Genesis tells us. And He has another little bonus act as He creates humanity. That's you and me. And He plants us in this garden. So it's almost like the symmetry of a tree and humanity here. We're just walking, living trees almost in this picture. It's one of the ways we can see the story unfolding. And we are also called and mandated to rule and reign, to bear fruit and to multiply and fill the earth. Just like a tree would bear fruit, we are called to bear fruit. And there we have this beautiful story. And the reason why I'm putting this into chapter 1 and why it's so important for us to understand it is out there is a lot of ideas regarding the 2-chapter gospel story. And that story is basically that everything material is bad. And your main focus in life would be to reject all the material things in this world and just make sure that your soul and your spirit can one day go to heaven. The only problem with that is in the gospel story, the real story that the Bible tells us and we hear from Jesus and His journey is that everything God created is actually very good. And we are appointed to rule over His creation, this earth. So here we have it, a being that creates a good world, and everything in it He entrusts to us to rule and reign over. In fact, it was created for His glory, and finally He crowns humanity with glory and the honor and privilege of leading and ruling over this creation. So there we have it. Chapter 1 of our story, and everything looks amazing. It's a good world, and we have a great purpose and significance. We need to rule and reign over God's world, and we do this with Him. Or so we think. Because in chapter 2, there is something interesting busy happening. Now, in Genesis chapter 1, we see humanity being mandated to rule over the earth. But in Genesis chapter 2, we see God taking Adam and Eve on a little bit of an expedition, a training, as you might say, on how to be ruling over the earth. And we see that he starts off by instructing Adam to name the animals, and exactly like he did, to bring order by naming things. You see, in the beginning, when God separated light from darkness, he called the light, he named it day, and the darkness he named night. And now he says, Adam, I want you to do the same. And guys, in the same way in our journey, when we are to rule over God's creation, the number one thing that we need to do is to name, to identify what something is in our life. I don't know if you've ever been in that space where you're entering into a new season in life. You don't really understand what it's all about until you can name what's happening. And then suddenly when you've identified, God is doing this in my life, now I know what's the purpose of this time, how do I position myself, and where do I fit in this? What's my place in this next season of life? And in the same way, God instructs us to rule over life. But he doesn't only instruct us by naming things and identifying what's the stuff that he created and how it should function and where it should fit. He actually moves on and he says, I'm empowering you guys to do it in two specific ways. He says, when you rule, you should never rule alone. And he gives Adam and Eve. And there's this journey of humanity walking together and ruling and naming and finding purpose and place for the things in this world together. And then he gives us another tool and he says, you don't do this alone and you don't do it with your own perspective of what is good and evil. And that's that famous verse that we read about in Genesis chapter 2 where God comes to Adam and he instructs him and says, listen, you never eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You just eat from the tree of life. That's what we were instructed to do, and that is God himself. We walk with him and we rule from his perspective of good and evil. And so steps in Genesis chapter 3, where everything that looks good is not as good as it seems. Because there's this snake, another creature, that comes into the story, and what we know about the snake is, first of all, that he talks. So can I just say, ladies, whenever you see a talking snake, it's time to get running. So that's the first thing. But secondly, this snake, this part of God's creation, opposes his ways. And he tempts humanity into taking control into their own hands and decide what is good and what is not good, instead of surrendering to God's view of what's good and not good. And if we're really honest with one another, when you look at the world around you, whenever we see death and sin and bad things happening in this world, is whenever humanity takes that right into their own hands. Let's just use that example, for instance, when Hitler decided it's maybe a good thing to put thousands of Jews into concentration camps and kill people on a mass scale. That's taking the right to determine what's good and not good into your own hands. Or when you think about systems out there, I'm just thinking about world news today. When you look at Russia and a guy deciding it's maybe a good idea, to go into war. How can that at all be a good picture? However, it's not just on a global scale or on big scales that this happens. It also happens in your own life. And I want you to think about that within the story. Because you were not created to decide what's good and not good. You're not created to rule from your perspective of what's good and evil. We were created to rule from God's perspective. So we have a bit of a problem. But all hope is not lost. Because in Genesis chapter 3, there's this beautiful verse in verse 15 when God rocks up and he finds Adam and Eve and he finds humanity in this dilemma of where they've decided what's good and not good in their own hands, and he gives them a promise when he speaks to this snake. He says, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, as he speaks to this agent, the snake, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Guys, here is where we find hope. Right at the beginning, at the first moment where we see trouble and death entering into this world, we see God giving a promise of victory over death. And the victory lies within the birth of a virgin mother that gives birth to a man that will be in a struggle. He will be a wounded victor as his heel is struck and he crushes this snake's head. There is this epic battle waiting in our story. And that takes us to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is where we meet Mary, the beginning, where she gives birth as a virgin to Jesus Christ. The one who claims to be this victorious one. The one that is the wounded victor. The one that was nailed to a cross so that we might have freedom. And I just want to quickly dive into the story a little bit for you, because in the theme and the topic of gardens, we also find Jesus in a garden just before he takes up his cross and he goes to die. It's the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's standing, as it may, in front of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in that moment, as he talks to his Father and he questions, is there maybe another way? Is this the only way? Is this really the good way? That I would go and die on a cross right now to save all of humanity. Is this your picture of what is good? And I think it's a fair question. I think if you think about it for a moment, imagine someone comes to you and asks you, listen, last night I had a wonderful time spending time with God, and he placed it on my heart that I should go and kill myself for the rest of the world. If you listen to someone like that, you would think, I don't think you need God, I think you need a doctor. You maybe need some help to get a grip on reality. However, something that seems so unreal became a big, big reality in Jesus' journey. And Jesus decided to not take that right of deciding what's good and evil in his own hands and submit to God's way. And that became the greatest moment in all of human history. That became the place of hope. The moment where we could see tree of life. Now, Jesus speaks about that. He talks about a seed that needs to go into the ground and needs to die so that there can be a great harvest coming up, that there can be lots and lots of life and fruit bearing from that one little seed. And here we have it, Jesus, the seed of a woman, dying on the cross. And then he gets taken into a tomb, which is so interesting. The tomb Jesus was laid down in was inside of a garden. And when Jesus was risen from the dead and Mary met him for the first time, she mistaken him for a gardener. I don't know if you realize this, but this links back to our story from the beginning in chapter 1, where we have Adam and Eve placed in a garden, and they mandated to be gardeners, to cultivate the earth, that they live in, to bear fruit. Here we have a second Adam in a new garden, and he is the tree of life. And whoever takes from him will have life, and life in abundance. And that brings us to chapter 4. Because this Adam, as Paul puts it, he says, for if by the trespasses of one man death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace, of the gift of righteousness, reign in life through that one man, Jesus Christ. Jesus is on a mission. He came to make everything new, and he is the first new. He is the first picture of what that new creation looks like. He is the second Adam. God is doing a new thing through Jesus. In fact, that's chapter 4's conclusion, because in the Bible, we always have this story from gardens to cities, from gardens to cities. We start in the Garden of Eden and we end in the city of Babylon. And here we start in the Garden of Gethsemane and we're ending in the new Jerusalem. And Jesus is sitting on the throne and he's saying, behold, that's in Revelations 21, I am making all things new. And this is why the 4th chapter gospel is so significant. Because Jesus didn't come to get people to heaven. No, he came to bring heaven to us. Therefore, the church is invited, and he gives us the authority, and he mandates us to go out there and make disciples and change this world into a place where we see him reign, and no longer we reign. No longer our view of what's good and not good, but now his view of what's good and not good. To follow him as he followed, as he walked that road. And he became a new picture for us. So whenever you or I, as followers of Jesus, wants to be a part of his mission, his generous love act mission that's making everything new, It happens by starting with you, having faith that God can make you new. Secondly, your neighbor new, and then ultimately your city and this world a brand new place. And that practically happens every time you choose to submit to God's will, to follow Him, like Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane, to love your neighbor, to be generous, to forgive, to be a blessing, to stand up for injustice, to give grace. That's the picture. That's why we're involved in something like a street store in the city of Bloemfontein and our Piso home and our school environments, to see His kingdom come and His will be done. So, may you, as you follow Jesus, see a new thing happening in this world. Great, guys. If this was helpful to you in any way, I'd love it if you can click that subscribe button and even share it with some friends and family to discover what's the full picture of the gospel. It's not just a wait for one day to go to heaven, but it's actually changing the world right now. God bless you.